I want to do just a quick thing about compost and the fineness of it and everything. If you look back in several of my videos, I talk about screening compost. And this is my screen I built years ago. And it's still holding up somehow. But it's basically just a wooden frame, and it has a 3/8 screen. And what I will do, I don't screen all the compost I make and run it through a screen and all that kind of stuff. That's not what I do. I think there was some confusion I've gotten some questions about that and what size screen and all that. That is not my priority with compost. I only screen it for a few uses. I'll screen some of it off. I'll use it in compost tea. I use it for small plants and transplants, seedlings and things like that because it's really fine. Even though it's like a 3/8 screen, by the time you screen it and shovel it and scrape it through, it actually breaks it up pretty fine. And it's not ideal to put in your garden, as you know, in that state. When you're building a bed or spreading it over your garden or whatever, you actually want it to be somewhat still a little chunky. Now this stuff is, I just harvested this today from my latest pile. When it gets to the point where you cannot tell a leaf from a piece of grass, from a piece of food, from a stick, that's well into compost. You honestly want to have some chunkiness. That's a big part of compost, is the chunkiness to it and having some bits of leaves and twigs and larger bits and pieces. You don't want this super fine, black, perfect, almost coffee ground looking stuff. Now, one way you can kind of tell your compost is, aside from the visually, seeing that everything's broken down and it gets to the point that you can't recognize things in it, is grab a handful and squeeze it good and tight. It'll kind of hold together, but with just the slightest pressure, it just breaks apart. And down in here, as you can see, what's been screened, it's much finer. It looks really good. You definitely wouldn't want to just use this in a potted plant, because let me grab a handful of this and squeeze it. Alright, it turns into a much more dense, it doesn't break apart as easily. It holds a lot of water. It can, over time, if it's out in the sun and watering, it can almost turn into a clay-like, very dense material and not be provide good aeration as something like this. That's much thicker and chunkier and doesn't compact as much. Both compost builds a crust. That's one of the drawbacks of compost on top of your soil. The best way to combat that is use a mulch over the top of it so your compost doesn't crust up, because it'll do that. That's just the nature of compost. But if you were to use something like this, you'd really have a very dense, thick, it's beneficial, but the only reason that I screen stuff is to use in my compost and for small transplants and things like that, and 9 times out of 10 I will mix this with peat moss or something like Miracle-Gro. I will take like 50-50, some of this and Miracle-Gro, and mix it together. The Miracle-Gro is pretty chunky, has a lot of peat moss and stuff, and it keeps that aeration. But then you've got the good bacteria in the food and whatnot out of this. You're getting a great benefit out of it, and it works great. But the Miracle-Gro and potting mixes and a lot of others are plenty chunky. You don't need more chunky compost. This right here works great. Just wanted to make that clear. I've had questions over that over the years, and I never really made a video about that. But the only reason to really have to screen compost is for just the purpose of having really fine stuff that's pretty. So, because that chunk and some of that undecomposed material is providing food and continuing to support life, and it's breaking down and getting into the soil. This is the stuff you want. It's got little bits of stick and twig and leaf in it, but it's mostly, the majority of it is unrecognizable of what it used to be. But you wouldn't want to create a level of, you wouldn't want to take this really fine stuff and put a couple inches of it around your plant. It's going to create a barrier. It'll actually dry. It'll repel water really badly when you try to water and things like that. So you wouldn't want to mix it in kind of around the plant. So that's the difference. And I know a lot of people ask me about the screening and stuff. It's not a necessity. Screening is not a necessity with compost. Really, a little more chunky it is much, much better. It holds enough water. It lets enough water out. It provides aeration. It's just perfect when it's a little chunky still. You can still see bits of twig and leaf and things like that. This stuff is pretty and show-offy, but it's really not perfect. You know, it's a little too finely ground for what most people typically use compost for. And so thanks for watching. I hope it kind of clarity on that.